again, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate you taking the time to help with this project. I first want to start off with kind of how you came to the Richmond area. Are you originally from Virginia or Richmond?
No, I'm from South Dakota.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How did we end up in Richmond?
It's sort of, it was sort of a journey. I went to undergrad in Nebraska and then moved down to Florida with a friend who was going to FSU. And I did not go to FSU, but I studied with one of the professors there, and then we both got into grad school at JMU in Harrisonburg.
Mm-hmm.
And then I visited Richmond a couple of times, and I really liked, especially Carytown. It's like so cute and charming, and like there are a bunch of people. Like I just felt like I found my people here in Richmond, like weirdos with tattoos and piercings. So I decided to move here because it was a very doable move from Harrisonburg. And one of the first things that I did when I moved here was join the Richmond Philharmonic. And that was really my entry point to the music scene.
Yeah. So are you still with the Richmond Philharmonic?
I'm actually taking a break this year just because I've been so busy, and I have an old shoulder injury. That's kind of been a challenge, like finding the time to work out and do self-care so that I'm not exacerbating the injury every time I play has been a challenge with classical rap and teaching and gigging.
Yeah. So I was perusing your website.
Oh no.
No, it's a great website.
Oh, thank you.
And so you mentioned, so you're doing teaching, you do gigs, and obviously you're working with classical rev. What do you find is kind of the biggest role that takes up most of your time, or that's most significant to you, or are they all kind of equal?
That's a really good question. So I feel like a lot of my emotional energy is spent on classical rev. And I would rather it be spent on my students because I have many students. I think I have over 30 students right now. And I would like to give them more of my energy, but classical rev is a really big project, and it takes up maybe not like an extraordinary amount of time, but like when I'm not teaching, I'm usually thinking about classical rev.
That's right.
And gigging is like I just don't have a lot of time to do many gigs this year. In the past, I used to like have a wedding gig almost every weekend. And this year, I've kind of been stepping away from that, trying to find a better work-life balance. And so every once in a while, there's like the perfect storm of gigs. Like last weekend, I had 2 shows on Friday night and 2 shows on Sunday night, and it was like I thought I was gonna lose my mind, but it was pretty rewarding and fun, even though it required like extra time and extra effort. But to answer your question, I think it's mostly classical rep and then teaching and then gigging. But gigging is like I'm trying to make it my creative outlet. For example, I played a show with Radio B, who's a rapper around town. I don't know if you've ever seen him on the mural on Broad Street.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you know which one I'm talking about. It's like near Roseneath, I think. But he invited me to play with him on a live stream show from In Your Ear Studios, and that was super fun, and it took a fair bit of time to prepare, but it was amazing. It was like one of my favorite shows that I've ever played. So
that's super interesting. That's really cool. So a little about classical rev, and you mentioned you went to school in Nebraska. And I did, in my prior research, I did read that you were involved with a string quartet that did similar work to what classical rev does. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when I was at Nebraska, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, when I was there, the Kiara String Quartet was in residence, and they are all Juilliard graduates, just amazing humans and fabulous performers. And they were really big advocates of outreach. So one of our requirements as a quartet, or as any ensemble, I played with a few ensembles there, but one of the requirements for the class was that you had to do a performance somewhere that was not on campus. So we played in a bar, we played at a retirement community. I think most of the performances were at retirement communities, because as a transplant, I didn't have a lot of connections with like bars or restaurants or galleries, and I was just a wee babe. So yeah. We were not super adventurous when it came to choosing venues, but that was one of the requirements, and that was one of the really salient points of studying with the Chiara Quartet, was that to keep the music alive, we have to make it accessible and approachable to everyone.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did that experience inspire you to get involved with classical rev in Richmond? Yeah,
absolutely. It's funny though, I didn't know about classical rev until one of my friends from Nebraska moved to St. Louis? No. What is the capital of Missouri? Kansas City. Kansas City. There we go. Kansas City. I don't know if it's the capital, but it's the one that's in between Kansas and Missouri. But anyway, he joined a Classical Revolution chapter there, and I heard about it, and I was like, oh man, that's so cool. And then when I moved to Richmond, I was like, well, I don't know anybody here. I don't know the scene at all. I wonder if there's a Classical Rev chapter, and I looked it up, and there was. So, and of course, their values align like so closely to mine, which were influenced by the Chiara String Quartet.
That's great. I had a hard time finding when the Richmond Classical Rev chapter was founded. Do you know what year?
So it was started as like kind of a loose group of musicians in 2012, and then became a 501c3 nonprofit in 2015.
Okay. Okay, cool. So I know you said you didn't get out much in Nebraska because you were staying at those areas, but obviously Nebraska and Richmond, Virginia are very different areas. So can you kind of compare your experience there in that music scene and in Richmond and that music scene, and kind of the outreach and the differences in the two areas?
Yeah. In Nebraska, well, the town is just quite a bit smaller. I can't remember exactly how large Lincoln is, but when I was there, there was really like two areas of town that had arts and culture going on, and the rest was like suburban and rural kind of. There was one main street, O Street, and then the Haymarket down by the train tracks. And so those were the two main places where I played shows and went to shows as well. So it's just a much smaller scene, and I think it's a little, because Classical Revolution has done so much good work here, I think it was a little less open to classical music. Like not opposed to it. A band that I played with called Ryan Head in the Barroom, it had a really long name, Ryan Head in the Red Sky Barroom Orchestra, which had like oboe, clarinet, at one point trumpet, bass trombone, violin, viola, and cello, guitar, and voice. They were open to that kind of project, which was weird and like loosely classical. We did, I don't know if you know the Threepenny Opera, Kurt Weill's piece. I mean, it's like kind of, I think, if I remember correctly, somewhere between a musical and an opera, or an operetta, I think. But anyway, we did some songs from that classical piece, and they were receptive, but here it's, I mean, beautifully reassuring, because there are so many different neighborhoods around town, and pretty much not every business is open to having live classical music, but most of them are. it's actually hard to find opportunities for all of the interested places, which is really cool. I mean, it's, in some ways it's an easy sell, like free classical music, well, why would you not want that?
Right.
But I don't know, other differences. Was there any specific like area of difference that you were?
No, I was just curious in the general. Obviously, they're two very different places, very different cultures.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you said that a lot of places in Richmond are open to that, other than just getting free live music. It's a cool sell to have. But is there any other reason you feel like Richmond is really open to having that live music, live classical music?
I think it's just part of the culture here. It's not a part of the culture
Right.
in Nebraska, but it's just so much smaller. The people who are excited about it are just fewer in number. Whereas here, I feel like live music is, I mean, you can go almost anywhere and find live music of some kind. And I think Richmond citizens are really proud of that. We like our food, we like our beer, and we like our music.
Yeah.
I think. That's been my experience anyway. And Lincoln is not dissimilar. They really like their beer, and the food is like fine. And they like music, but Richmond is just
It's
more
an intense
vibrant.
culture.
Yeah,
like that.
it's
Yeah.
way more vibrant.
Totally agree. So I know you said you have live musicians that go and play in spaces, and I remember from when we chatted a few years ago, the Mozart Festival is a big thing. What are some of the other activities Classical Rep does to kind of help spread the classical music in Richmond?
Well, we do a variety of things. You mean in addition to performances?
Sure, yeah.
In addition. We try to sort of facilitate the formation of like chamber ensembles. So if someone comes to us, we're like happy to invite them to our performances and then introduce them to other people who are playing music. And the more people who are playing music, the more music there will be to share with others. So we do that. Networking is a big part of what we do in addition to our monthly events and the Mozart Festival. I'm actually really excited. We are not doing this yet, but one of the violinists who played with us a few years ago has become a web developer, and he is actually working on a website that will essentially be a database kind of where people can sign up and either advertise a gig that they're looking for players for, or apply for gigs that people have submitted. So it's going to be a really great resource, I think. I think it's also going to make a big difference in how much people are charging for gigs. I think there's not a consensus about how much musicians should be getting paid for like running gigs. I've run into, I think generally people are approaching a more reasonable, fair rate. But every once in a while I still get asked to play a gig for like $150 and I'm like, well, that's not quite enough. I just raised my rates, and part of that is because I actually don't have time to plan a lot of wedding gigs, and I'm like, well, if you want me to spend the time, you're gonna have to pay a little more. And almost in the hopes that people will see my price and go somewhere else. But
it's a strategy.
It's a strategy. I mean, the worst thing that happens is I have more time for myself, and the best thing that happens is I make like some money. So.
Your time is worth money too.
Yeah, it is.
It's great. A little bit, this is sort of connected to what we were just talking about in terms of financial, but how does Classical Rep fund these activities? I know you said musicians play for free, so is that a volunteer base?
Well, it depends on the event. Our monthly variety show, Classical Incarnations, is always volunteer based. We don't, although although in the past, Andrew McAvoy, when he was director, he would hire people to play like something specific, like kind of as the headliner at the end of the show. I have not done that as general director. I think that incarnations should be entirely a labor of love. And so for that particular project, which happens every month, it's always volunteer based. And then our other events, we usually try to have one additional event a month, and we do pay the performers for that. And then the Mozart Festival, we're working towards paying people more what their time is worth for that as well. And most of our funding comes from grants. I genuinely think our audiences, which are kind of small at each event, I mean, we're not booking concert halls, we're booking bars, and we're booking like art galleries where you can fit like maybe a maximum of 75 people if you're really lucky, if you get the right one. I think our audiences give what they're able to give, but it's not much. So a lot of our funding does come from grants, which I'm also hoping to change a bit this year. I'm hoping to get more sponsorships, because I think that is, like, obviously we need the public support to get the grants. We have to show that we're doing something that is valued by the public. But I think sponsorships will aid in that effort too, showing that we also have support of community businesses or corporate sponsors who are larger. And so I'm hoping going forward that our funding will come first from grants, then sponsorships, and then donations. But we have a very small budget. So it's not like an extraordinary amount of money regardless.
Right.
Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you. A little bit about the content itself. How would you define, or how does Classical Rev define classical music in Richmond and just in general?
That's a great question also. There are a lot of answers to it, and I think for Classical Rev, we don't have a strict definition. I think it just sort of depends on what the directors feel is classical. And I think Ellen, who founded the organization, and Andrew and I have slightly different interpretations. Ellen, for example, was pretty opposed for some reason to amplification. I think, well, I could speculate why that was. She never told me exactly, but it could have just been a practical concern, such as like, we don't have the skills to use amplification. Or it could have been like, well, if it's amplified, then is it really traditional classical music? But then that sort of eliminates from consideration all of the pieces that have been written in the 20th century that use like backing tracks or, some kind of electronic component. Andrew, when he took over, was all about amplification. He's a sound guy, so he has the skills and equipment to amplify, like, for example, classical guitars. Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's amazing. Yeah.
It's a very random instrument. but yeah.
That's awesome. Well, then it like doesn't project super well in a big hall.
Yeah.
So he would always amplify his guitar and help amplify other guitarists. And I think I may have an even looser definition of classical music, because one of my pet projects in the last couple of years was a collaboration with the rapper Radio V that I mentioned. That was how I met him, actually, through this collaboration where we brought a string quartet together with an MC and a producer with the intention of creating an original piece of music, but with no knowledge of what the other was bringing to the table. So what we wrote, well, the string quartet kind of improvised and until the producer had some samples that he wanted to work with, and then the rapper came up with this like amazing, powerful, like it's so good. You should check it out if you have a chance. It's called Stranger Things, and it's Radio B by Radio B and Name Brand, and it's on Spotify. But there's also a documentary about the making of the track. That was part of the grant that we wrote for this project. But anyway, a collaboration with a hip hop artist is not something that I think Andrew would have done. And I spoke with someone who was like, wow, it's wild that you did this, because Ellen would never have done something like that. But I think cross-pollination like that is really, really important. And I think the main thing that defines classical music is that, well, now we're getting like into philosophy. Like, what is art? I think art and music are things with intention behind them. So if you're intending to present something that is classical in your mind, then it's classical, if that makes sense. Yeah. That's my philosophy. But you could also say, like, if it's played on classical instruments, like instruments that would typically be used for classical music, then it's also maybe classical. And there are a few genres that are like sort of on the fringes, like jazz, I think is also classical, but it has its own space in the Richmond music scene. So we don't dabble in jazz that much. A little bit, occasionally. Like we featured a jazz ensemble playing Mozart themes and improvising over his like changes at the Mozart Festival. That's cool. And like I'm a Scottish fiddler, so I invited my teacher, who has won the national championship 10 times and is like from Scotland, and he's an amazing, impressive person. And that tradition is based on classical technique and written music, which is dissimilar to other fiddle traditions, which are allergic to technique and allergic to written music. Maybe that's uncharitable. Maybe I shouldn't say that. But so in a way, that's also kind of classical, but it's like not something we would present on it like every month. Sure. I don't know. It's a tricky question that you just asked.
I know you said you had some big projects coming up this year. Is there any kind of end goal that you're trying to reach, or like how are you defining success for classical Rev, if that makes sense?
That's also a really good question. So markers of success that we use for grant applications include audience reach. So how many people did we have attend our events? How many events did we successfully present? Did those events get support from the attendees in the form of donations? And how many new pieces of music did we present? And that is kind of my pet project as well. I think that if classical music is going to survive, we can't just exist on the same music by dead white men. Right. As I said before. And we have to show that the tradition is alive and thriving and still has something relevant to say. So one of our grant applications is actually with the Alan and Margot Blank Foundation. Alan Blank was a professor of composition, maybe at VCU. I should know more about this person, but so one of the big things that they emphasize is support of new music. So we present them with a list of the new pieces that we performed. And less formal benchmark of success is also the diversity that we see in the audience. That's also something that we should have statistics for in order to create really compelling grant applications. But it's a little trickier to assemble that data because we can't just like take a head count
Mm-hmm.
and be like, well, this percentage of the, it really requires, I think, like a demographic survey.
Mm-hmm.
But encouraging people to take surveys is sometimes challenging. I'm sure our audience would be willing if we explained that it would help us get grants, and fund our activities. But I don't know. It's just data collection is challenging, I think. But I would like to see more diversity in our audience for sure. I think we need to like branch out into different parts of the city, and be sure that we are marketing to audiences that maybe don't have access to like social media. That's like mainly our primary source of marketing. We hang posters too, but the posters typically go in like heavily populated areas like Carytown or downtown, or so I think we need to work to expand our marketing efforts as well.
Okay. Is there anything else that we haven't covered, talked about, that you would like to bring up?
Not that I can think of. I think we covered a lot of ground.
We did.
And as long as you feel like you got what you needed.
Definitely. And if there's anything else you think of that you want me to talk about, or you want to talk about more, you can always email me.
Yeah, and feel free to email me if you need more like elaboration on anything, or if you think of anything else.
Yes. And thank you so much again. I really appreciate
Yeah,
you helping me out.
Of course.